oh, the gun fired on its own. It wasn't me. I didn't even pull the trigger. Everyone from Alec Baldwin to the guy that we saw in the video a couple days ago, that bus driver and the former cop, well, everyone has the same excuse. Oh, it fired on its own. Is that really a thing or not? Well, that's what we'll talk about in this video. And the reality is that no, guns do not fire on their own, except very few cases, such as the horrible design of the P320 from SIG, which is just embarrassing that thing is being made these days, and let alone adopted by the US military. But unless you're talking about a very defective design, it's been over 100 years since guns have been safe enough that no, they just don't fire on their own. You're looking at something that is tremendously poorly designed so as to have that kind of potential issue. And even that is going to be extremely rare. What happens most of the time is that someone comes along and pulls the trigger and fires. And that's what we saw in said video. If you haven't seen it, it's about a cop and a bus driver that are arguing in the neighborhood because the bus driver has the music just too loud, and the former cop is angry, and he comes out with a revolver. And he has the brightest idea of not only keeping his finger within the trigger guard, but also, yeah, like that. He's like that. And at some point, and the bus driver is obviously not intimidated because he's a total badass, and he says, what are you gonna do? Shoot me, you asshole? And they start bumping against one another, and all of a sudden, boom. Because why? It fired on its own? No, because someone put enough pressure on the trigger so as to make it fire. And that's all there is to it, right? So the idea here is don't do that. Don't be this stupid idiot that does that kind of mistake. Two things from this video. You always keep your finger off the trigger guard. Always. There's no reason why you should go around like this. That's the trademark of a complete idiot and an absolute amateur in guns. The first thing you learn about firearms is you always keep your finger off the trigger guard until you're ready to fire, right? And you certainly don't go with your gun cocked in single action, right? Of course, you have this called Python, beautiful double action, single action revolver. The gun used by the former cop, I have no idea what it is. Doesn't really matter. Most revolvers are either based on Smith or on Colt designs, Colt Police Positive, or your the 1905 military police from Smith & Wesson. It's been around for over 100 years, and everything else you see is basically a copy of one of those two or something that's very close to that. There's really no reason why anyone would bother inventing anything that is that much different. So that's why it doesn't really matter. It's simply a double action, single action revolver with an exposed hammer. That's all you need to know. And anything that's been made in the last 100 years will have in itself mechanisms that make it super safe. Unless you are firing it, the gun will not fire on its own. None of these revolvers will, right? That's simply the way in which in which they've been made. Having said all of that, and yes, by the way, these are snap caps. These are not, oh, you're fighting. No, snap caps. You have a little spring in there, and that just takes the impact from the hammer, and that's it. So double action, single action. What we saw here was a guy that had the gun cocked and was ready to fire in single action with just a little bit of pressure. And he was such of a genius that he had his finger like this while threatening the fat bus driver that was not intimidated by the revolver. And he slapped the gun a bunch of times, and eventually in one of those contacts it ends up firing. But it does not fire on its own. Someone has to do that. Basically what I'm saying, guys, is you never put your finger inside the trigger guard. It's always kept like this, and a revolver is intended to be fired in double action. Double action, not single action. Yes, you can do it, and yes, there is something about the extra accuracy you can get out of it when you fire it in single action, because it is so much less pressure that you have to put in it, right? So when you're looking at a very long distance shot and you have all the time in the world and you want to manually cock the hammer, so be it. But in general, any kind of serious training will be 90%. And yeah, and if you're doing much of a serious training with a revolver, that is already kind of not much of a thing. Usually it's going to be semi-automatic pistols, but there are some classes there that focus on revolver. Even then, when you look at defensive shooting classes for revolvers, it's going to be 99% of the training, it's going to be in double action. And some of these guys will even cut away the hammer. They don't even want to have the hammer. It's all about the double action trigger, right? Why is it that you have it? Well, because you do have that option. It's less and less than the hammer. And one of the things you've noticed is that over the years, the hammer keeps getting smaller and smaller. This is almost like one of these evolution things from back in the day when revolvers were only single action. You had to manually cock the revolver because it did not fire on double action. It did not cock on its own when you just pull the trigger with that longer trigger distance, right? And that more pressure required. So you had to do that. Now, as technology kept evolving and the design became more heavily leaning towards the double action utility, you still have it, but again, these days there's a lot of people that will just go, I don't even want to have it. It just gets caught on stuff. Just give me the hammer, spurless hammer, right? This is the spur, so spurless hammer, or even like the bodyguard that covers everything here. Something like that tends to be the way it goes. But finger off the trigger guard at all times until you're ready to fire. And by all means, don't cock the gun when you're planning on using it for self-defense. That is the trademark of an amateur, even in posters these days. That it used to be that you would see like an action movie poster, right, from some film, a 007, and they were like, yeah, I'm ready. And this was back, like 50 years ago, you would see this sort of nonsense. Eventually, right, some of these consulting guys, military or cops or someone that knew at least something about guns, went to the director and said, you know what, it looks like shit. It really looks bad because that's not what people that know how to use firearms do. Oh, but it just looks so much cooler when I'm like this. This is the poster, not this crap. The responsible gun owner. No, if you're a badass, you're like, yeah, even better. Shoot, that's the kind of thing you used to see in posters in the 80s, maybe 90s even. But eventually, it got to the point where all of these guys that we're consulting with were like, no, listen, you look like a dumbass doing that. You are not some special ops badass dude if you're doing this. That's the trademark of someone that does not know how to use a firearm in a poster like, yeah, there I am, right? So you start seeing some more of this, right? More of the trained shooter doing his thing. You see a little bit more of that in spite of what the director thinks looks cooler or not. But anyway, guys, that's the topic of the video. See you next time. Take care.